I'm Miriam, a 55-year-old widow and carpenter, the kind of woman who's always relied on her hands to fix what's broken. Except I never realized how broken I was inside. For years, I buried myself in work, rebuilding a church steeple in honor of my late husband, but I couldn't see the cracks forming in my own soul. Then one day, in the blink of an eye, I fell from that steeple and woke up in a place more real than anything I've ever known. What I saw there shattered me, then rebuilt me, revealing the truth about love, sin, and the legacy we leave behind. That moment changed everything. The wind was stronger than I expected that morning, tugging at the hem of my work jacket as I stood on the scaffolding, staring up at the weathered steeple of our town's old church. The wood was worn thin in places, eaten away by time and neglect, but it had once been beautiful. I'd spent weeks working on it, one board at a time, each nail driven and with the same careful precision that my husband, Tom, used to teach me back when we were just starting out. He had loved this church, dreamed of seeing it restored to its former glory. I was trying to finish what he couldn't. The truth was, I hadn't stepped foot inside the sanctuary since his funeral. The memories felt too raw, too close. So I focused on the work above instead. The steeple was my escape, a place where I could pour my grief into something useful. That morning, though, even the steeple felt heavier than usual. My hands fumbled as I reached for a beam, the hammer slipping from my fingers and clanging loudly on the platform below. I cursed under my breath. Not exactly language fit for church property, but then again, I wasn't exactly fit for it either. Miriam, a voice called from below, sharp and impatient. I glanced down to see Mark O'Brien, the councilman who seemed to think every delay on this project was my personal failure. He stood on the grass with his arms crossed, looking up at me like I was a slacker on the job. You're running behind schedule again. We've got people asking questions about whether this is even worth it. I bit back the urge to snap at him. It'll be done when it's done, Mark. You can't rush something like this. Maybe someone else should have taken it over, he shot back. Someone with more time and energy. That one stung. I knew he wasn't just talking about my work. He'd been hinting for weeks that I was too old, too tired, too distracted to finish this project. Maybe he was right, but I wasn't going to let him see me crack. Not here, not now. So I waved him off and got back to work. The wind picked up again as I braced myself against the scaffolding, gripping the beam I was trying to secure. The ground felt too far away, the sky too close. A strange heaviness settled in my chest, an unease I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just the pressure of Mark's words and the weight of everything else I'd been carrying lately. Tom's absence, the bills piling up, the guilt I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I reached for the next nail, but my hand slipped. I lost my balance for just a moment, a heartbeat, maybe two, but it was enough. The world tilted beneath me as my foot slipped off the edge of the platform. I grabbed for something, anything, but my fingers scraped against empty air. Gravity pulled me down fast and hard, and all I could think was, this is it. This is how it ends. Then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the light. It wasn't blinding or harsh like I would have expected, but soft and golden, like the glow of a sunrise that stretched on forever. I wasn't lying on the ground anymore. There was no pain, no broken bones, no blood. Instead, I stood in a space that felt impossibly vast and yet comforting, like it had been waiting for me all along. The workshop stretched out before me, filled with tools unlike anything I'd ever seen. Hammers, chisels, saws. They shimmered as if made of pure light, their edges sharp but inviting. I reached out to touch one, but before I could, a presence filled the room. I turned and there he was, the carpenter. He didn't say anything at first, but I knew it was him. There was something in his eyes, a depth, a warmth, that made me feel completely exposed and completely safe all at once. He looked at me as though he knew every part of me, the good and the bad, and loved me anyway. It was overwhelming. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Without speaking, he gestured to a table in the center of the workshop. On it was a frame, half finished, and beside it a pile of materials waiting to be shaped into something more. I didn't need words to understand what he was asking. He wanted me to build the mirror. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, but my hands moved almost instinctively, picking up the tools. The wood was smooth, the nails bright, and as I worked, the mirror began to take shape. It wasn't like anything I'd ever built before. This wasn't just about craftsmanship. It was about something deeper, something I couldn't quite put into words. But then, as I stepped back to look at what I'd created, the mirror began to change. The surface rippled like water, and images began to form. At first, they were beautiful. Memories of my life with Tom, our wedding day, the house we built together, the laughter we shared. But then the images shifted. The moments I wanted to forget came flooding back. I saw the arguments, the cold silences, the times I let my pride get in the way of saying, I'm sorry. I saw the hurt in Tom's eyes when I lashed out at him over something small, and the way he always forgave me, even when I didn't deserve it. The mirror showed me my faults, my sins, the parts of myself I had spent years trying to bury. I couldn't look anymore. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice trembling. I've already paid for my mistakes. Isn't that enough? The carpenter didn't answer right away. He just stepped closer, his presence steady and unshakable. Then, without speaking, he touched the mirror. The cracks that had begun to form in its surface glowed faintly, and he turned to me with a look that seemed to pierce straight to my soul. Only love withstands the test of eternity, he said, his voice clear and firm. The cracks revealed the light. I didn't know what he meant then, not fully, but I could feel something inside me beginning to shift. The weight I'd been carrying for so long, the guilt, the regret, felt different somehow. Lighter, maybe. Or maybe it was just that I could finally see it for what it was. I didn't have time to think about it further. The light in the workshop began to grow brighter, enveloping everything around me. The carpenter stepped back, his gaze steady, as if to say there was still more for me to learn. And then, just like that, I was back. The light faded, replaced by the harsh fluorescence of a hospital room. My chest ached, my body felt bruised and battered, but I was alive. The beeping of monitors filled the air, and a nurse leaned over me, her face a mix of relief and concern. You're awake, she said softly. We thought we'd lost you. So had I. But I knew now that I hadn't just been spared. I'd been given something. A truth. A second chance. And I knew I couldn't waste it. When I came to, the memory of the workshop clung to me like a dream I couldn't shake, vivid and real, yet impossible to explain. The hospital room around me was sterile and bright, the beeping of the monitors relentless, but my mind was still back in that golden place. It was the mirror I couldn't stop thinking about. I had seen things in it, things I didn't want to face, and now, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't unsee them. The nurse came in, brisk and efficient, checking my vitals and murmuring something about how lucky I was. A fall like that, honestly, you shouldn't even be alive, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. The paramedics said you were gone for a few minutes. They thought they'd lost you. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Gone. That word stuck in my mind, turning over and over. I wasn't sure where I had been, but it didn't feel like I had been lost. If anything, I felt like I'd been found. Mark showed up later that afternoon, his face a mixture of concern and something else, guilt. Maybe, though he tried to hide it. Miriam, he started, his voice uncharacteristically soft. How are you feeling? Alive, I said, my voice hoarse. Which is more than I can say for this morning. He winced, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I didn't mean to push you so hard. I know how much this project means to you. I almost laughed at that, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I waved him off, muttering something about how it wasn't his fault. In truth, I didn't want to talk about the steeple or the fall or any of it. Not with him, not yet. There was too much in my head, too much I still needed to figure out. The days that followed were a blur of recovery. Physical therapy, follow-up appointments, and well-meaning visitors filled my time, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the workshop and the carpenter. Every night, I lay awake, replaying his words over and over. Only love withstands the test of eternity. The cracks reveal the light. What did it mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a second chance. But at what? At life? At love? At fixing all the things I had broken over the years? The more I thought about it, the more the mirror haunted me. It hadn't just shown me memories, it had shown me the truth. And the truth was, I had spent too much of my life building walls instead of bridges, holding on to pride instead of offering grace. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the memories from the mirror came rushing back. I saw Tom's face again, the sadness in his eyes when I'd said something sharp and unnecessary. I saw my son, Jamie, as a teenager, walking out the door after another argument about his grades, his music, his friends, whatever I had decided to harp on that day. And I saw myself, sitting in the church pews on Sunday mornings, nodding along to sermons about forgiveness and love, but never letting those words sink into my heart. The weight of it all felt unbearable. I sat up in bed, my chest tight, tears streaming down my face. Why did you show me all this? I whispered into the darkness. What am I supposed to do with it? The silence that followed felt deafening, but in it, I felt a small stirring, a nudge in my heart. It wasn't an answer exactly, but it was something, a reminder. The cracks revealed the light. The next morning, I woke up determined to do something, though I wasn't entirely sure what. The first step, I decided, was calling Jamie. It had been months since we last spoke, months of silence born from years of misunderstandings and resentment. I wasn't even sure if he'd pick up, but I had to try. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Mom. His voice was cautious, uncertain. Everything okay? Hi, Jamie, I said, my voice trembling. I I just wanted to hear your voice, to see how you're doing. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. I'm fine, he said finally. How about you? I heard about the accident. Are you okay? I'm better than I have any right to be, I said, and I meant it. Listen, Jamie, I know I haven't been the best mom. I know I've hurt you, and I've said things I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. For all of it. The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. For a moment, I thought he might hang up, that my apology had come too late. But then he spoke, his voice softer than before. I appreciate that, Mom. I really do. We talked for a little while after that, nothing too deep, but it was a start. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, like a small piece of the weight I'd been carrying had lifted. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to give me hope. Over the next few weeks, I started to mend other relationships too. I reached out to old friends I had pushed away, neighbors I had been too proud to ask for help from. And slowly, I began to see the cracks in my life for what they were, not failures, but opportunities. Opportunities to let the light in. But even as I worked to rebuild those connections, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more I needed to do. The steeple remained unfinished, a constant reminder of the work I had left behind. And though the thought of climbing back up there terrified me, I knew I couldn't leave it undone. Not now. Not after everything. I called Mark one afternoon, my hands trembling as I dialed his number. When he picked up, I took a deep breath and said, I want to finish the steeple, but I'm going to need some help. To my surprise, he didn't argue. I'll round up a crew, he said. You just tell us what you need. Hanging up the phone, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The steeple wasn't just a project anymore. It was a symbol, a chance to put everything I had learned into action. And as daunting as it felt, I knew I couldn't turn back. I still didn't have all the answers, but I was starting to understand the message I had been given. The mirror had shown me my flaws, yes, but it had also shown me my potential. The cracks weren't there to condemn me. They were there to guide me, to remind me of the light that could still shine through. As I stood at the base of the steeple the next morning, the tools in my hands and the crew gathered around me, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't just rebuilding the church. I was rebuilding myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. When I arrived at the church that morning, the air was crisp and the sky stretched out clear and endless, as if daring me to climb again. The scaffolding loomed in front of me, a silent reminder of my fall and everything that had followed. My heart pounded as I stared up at it. Part of me wanted to turn around, climb into my truck, and leave the steeple to someone else. But I couldn't. Not anymore. This wasn't just about finishing the project, it was about finishing something inside me. Mark was already there with a small crew of volunteers. Some were familiar faces from the congregation, people I'd known for years but had never really let in. Others were younger, kids who had probably been dragged there by their parents. They milled around awkwardly, waiting for direction, and when they saw me, a few nodded politely, their expressions cautious. I knew what they were thinking. Can she really handle this? After what happened, I squared my shoulders and walked over to Mark, ignoring the knot of anxiety twisting in my gut. "Thanks for coming," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We've got a lot of work to do." He handed me a clipboard and gestured toward the scaffolding. "We're ready when you are." I glanced up again, the height suddenly more intimidating than it had been before. My palms felt clammy, and I gripped the clipboard tighter to keep my hands from shaking. "Let's get started," I said, forcing myself to sound confident. "The sooner we finish, the better." As the crew began unloading supplies and organizing tools, I climbed the first few rungs of the ladder. The wood felt solid beneath my hands, but my pulse quickened with every step. When I reached the platform, I paused, taking a deep breath and trying to steady myself. The view from up here hadn't changed, but I had. This time, I wasn't alone. Below me, the volunteers moved with purpose, their chatter a steady hum that anchored me. I picked up a hammer and got to work, measuring and marking the beams for the next section. My hands shook at first, but the rhythm of the work calmed me. There was something comforting about the weight of the tools, the smell of the wood, the sound of nails being driven into place. It reminded me of all the hours I'd spent building things with Tom, hours where the world felt simple, where problems could be solved with a little effort and the right tools. As the day went on, something began to shift. The crew, who had started out hesitant and unsure, began to work together more seamlessly. Conversations flowed more easily, laughter breaking through now and then. I caught snippets of their chatter, stories about their families, their lives, their hopes for the church. It reminded me of the mirror, of the way our lives were all connected, each small moment rippling out in ways we couldn't always see. By midday, we had made real progress. The steeple was starting to take shape, the new beams fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. I could feel the tension in my chest easing, replaced by something else, something warmer, lighter. It wasn't just the satisfaction of the work, it was the realization that I wasn't carrying this burden alone anymore. During a break, I climbed down from the scaffolding to check on the crew. One of the younger volunteers, a teenage boy with shaggy hair and a nervous smile, approached me. "Mrs. Hale," he said, fidgeting with the hem of his sweatshirt, "I just wanted to say it's really cool what you're doing. My mom said you've been working on this for a long time." I smiled, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you. It's been a journey, that's for sure." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I know it's not the same, but I lost my dad last year. He used to bring me to this church when I was little. It means a lot, seeing it being fixed up." His words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Your dad would be proud of you," I said finally, "of the work you're doing here. It's important." He looked up at me then, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thanks, Mrs. Hale." As he walked away, I felt a lump rise in my throat. The cracks in my heart, the ones I had spent so much time trying to hide, felt a little less jagged, a little more bearable. The boy's words reminded me of why I had started this project in the first place, of the legacy Tom had wanted to leave behind. It wasn't just about the church, it was about the people it brought together. By the time the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, the steeple was nearly complete. The final beams had been secured, and all that was left was the cross. It had been sitting in storage for years, waiting for its place at the top. Mark and I hauled it up to the platform together, the weight of it heavier than I expected. As we worked to secure it, I felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, grief, hope, all swirling together. When the cross was finally in place, I stepped back to look at it. The steeple stood tall against the evening sky, its lines clean and strong, a testament to the work we had done. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, like something inside me had finally settled. The crew gathered below, their faces upturned, and a cheer went up as the last rays of sunlight caught the cross, making it glow. I climbed down to join them, my legs shaky but steady, and as I looked around at their smiling faces, I realized something. This wasn't just my victory, it was ours. That night, as I sat on the porch of my house, watching the stars blink to life in the sky, I thought about the workshop, the mirror, and the carpenter's words. The cracks reveal the light. I didn't fully understand it then, but I was starting to. The cracks in my life, the places where I had failed, weren't just scars. They were openings, places where grace could shine through. I still had a lot of work to do. There were people I needed to make amends with, wounds that needed healing. But for the first time, I didn't feel overwhelmed by the weight of it all. I felt hopeful. I had been given a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. After the steeple was finished, I thought the sense of closure I'd been chasing might finally settle over me. But as the days passed, I realized there was still a gnawing inside me, a feeling that the work wasn't over. The steeple stood tall and proud, a beacon for the town. But what about the people who passed beneath it? What about the ones I had hurt, the ones I had neglected? A cross on top of a building couldn't heal the cracks in my relationships, and it certainly couldn't fix the fractures in my own heart. The first Sunday service after the steeple was completed, I stood at the back of the church, unsure if I belonged there. The congregation filed in slowly, nodding to one another, shaking hands, exchanging smiles. They seemed so at ease, so at home, and I felt like an outsider looking in. The last time I'd been in those pews was for Tom's funeral, and even then, I'd barely been present. My mind clouded with grief and anger. Now, I felt like a stranger in a place that had once been familiar. I slipped into the last row just as the service began, hoping to blend in. The pastor, a kind man named Reverend Phillips, stepped up to the pulpit, his voice steady and warm as he welcomed everyone. Today, he said, we celebrate not just the restoration of our steeple, but the restoration of something deeper, the spirit of community that binds us together. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on faces I hadn't really seen in years. There was Mrs. Miller, the widow who used to bake pies for every church potluck. I remembered snapping at her once when she offered to bring me dinner after Tom died. And there was the Hendricks family, who had asked for my help repairing their fence last year. I'd made excuses, too consumed with my own grief to see their need. The cracks in my life weren't just about my own pain. They had spread outward, touching everyone around me. After the service, I lingered at the back, unsure of whether to stay or slip out quietly. But before I could make a decision, Mrs. Miller approached me, her face alight with gratitude. "Miriam," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "It's so good to see you here. And that steeple, it's beautiful. You've done something wonderful for this town." "Thank you," I said, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people helped." She smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "Sometimes it takes a community to rebuild, doesn't it?" Her words stayed with me long after I left the church. She was right. I had spent so much of my life trying to do everything on my own, thinking I had to carry the weight of the world by myself. But maybe the carpenter's lesson wasn't just about my own cracks. Maybe it was about letting others help fill them, about being part of something bigger than myself. That afternoon, I decided to take the first step toward mending what I had broken. I picked up the phone and called Jamie. We'd spoken briefly after the accident, but it hadn't been enough. There was still so much unsaid between us, and I knew the only way forward was to face it head on. "Hey, Mom," he said when he answered, his voice cautious but not unkind. "Hi, Jamie," I said, my palms sweating even though I was sitting in the comfort of my own living room. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how things have been." He didn't say anything, but I could hear him breathing on the other end, waiting for me to continue. I know I haven't been the mother you needed, I said, my voice trembling. I've let my pride get in the way of listening to you, of understanding you. And I'm so sorry for that. I want to do better. I want us to be better. There was a long pause, and I braced myself for his response, unsure of whether he'd be willing to forgive me. But when he spoke, his voice was softer than I'd expected. I appreciate you saying that, Mom. I really do. I think, I think we both have things we need to work on. Relief washed over me, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope for our relationship. We talked for a while after that about his life, his work, his plans for the future. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was a start, and that was enough. Over the next few weeks, I kept reaching out, not just to Jamie, but to others I'd pushed away over the years. I visited Mrs. Miller and thanked her for her kindness. I offered to fix the Hendricks family's fence, a gesture that led to an afternoon of shared laughter and stories. Slowly, the cracks in my relationships began to mend, the light seeping through in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, I found myself back at the church, standing beneath the steeple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The golden light bathed the cross, making it glow against the darkening sky. I thought about the carpenter, about his words, and I realized that the work he had called me to wasn't just about building something physical. It was about building something spiritual, something lasting. The steeple was finished, but the real restoration had just begun. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The morning of the dedication ceremony arrived, and I couldn't shake the mix of nerves and anticipation that had been building in my chest. The church steeple, standing tall and pristine against the pale blue sky, was finally complete. For weeks, it had been the talk of the town, a symbol of renewal and hope for a community that had endured its own quiet struggles. But for me, it was so much more. It was the physical manifestation of something deeply personal, a journey that had begun the moment I woke up in that hospital bed and decided to rebuild not just the steeple, but the broken parts of my life. I arrived at the church early, wanting a moment alone before the crowd filled the sanctuary. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the churchyard, and the air was crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. I stood at the base of the steeple, looking up at the cross perched at the very top. The sunlight caught its edges, making it gleam like it was lit from within. I thought about all the hands that had come together to make it happen, the volunteers, the neighbors, the strangers who had offered their time and effort without asking for anything in return. It was humbling to think that so many people had cared enough to see it through. I stepped inside the church, the wooden pews polished and glowing in the soft light streaming through the stained glass windows. It had been years since I'd allowed myself to feel at home here, but something about this morning felt different. There was a quiet peace in the air, a sense of something greater than myself. I made my way to the front of the sanctuary, where the pastor had set up a small podium for the ceremony. A bouquet of fresh flowers rested nearby, their fragrance subtle but sweet. As I stood there, memories of the celestial workshop and the carpenter came flooding back to me. I could almost hear his voice again, steady and clear. The cracks reveal the light. I had spent so much time thinking about those words, trying to understand what they meant, and now, standing in this place, I felt like I finally did. The cracks in my life, the pain, the mistakes, the regrets, they weren't just scars. They were openings, places where grace and love could shine through if I let them. People began to arrive shortly after, their voices filling the sanctuary with warmth and life. Familiar faces greeted me with smiles and nods, and I felt a flicker of pride seeing how many had come to celebrate this moment. Mark was there, standing near the back with his arms crossed, looking both pleased and slightly out of place. Jamie walked in a few minutes later, and my heart swelled seeing him there. We'd been talking more in the weeks leading up to this day, and though things weren't perfect between us, they were better. He waved at me, and I waved back, a small but meaningful gesture. When it was time to speak, Reverend Philip stood at the podium first, his voice warm and full of gratitude. He talked about the history of the church, the importance of community, and the significance of the steeple as a symbol of faith and resilience. His words were thoughtful and heartfelt, and by the time he gestured for me to come forward, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing on my shoulders. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium, the congregation's eyes fixed on me. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. Public speaking had never been my strong suit, and the emotions swirling inside me felt too big to put into words. But then I remembered the carpenter's face, the way he had looked at me with such calm certainty, and I knew I had to try. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice shaky, but steady enough. "This steeple, it's more than just wood and nails. It's a testament to what we can accomplish when we come together. But for me, it's also a reminder of something deeper. It's a reminder that even when things feel broken, even when we feel broken, there's always hope for restoration." I paused, scanning the room, letting the words settle. A few months ago, I fell from this very steeple. I don't remember much about the fall itself, but I do remember what happened after. I had an experience, one I can't fully explain, but it changed me. I was shown things about my life, things I didn't want to see, truths I had been avoiding. And I realized how much I had let pride and pain keep me from truly living, from truly loving. The room was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy with understanding. I pressed on, my voice growing steadier. But I also learned something else. I learned that the cracks in our lives, the mistakes, the losses, the places where we feel most broken, they're not the end of the story. They're where the light gets in. They're where grace can work, where love can grow. I glanced at Jamie, his face thoughtful and serious, and my voice softened. This steeple is more than just a project. It's a symbol of second chances, of what happens when we let others in, when we let ourselves be vulnerable enough to accept help, to offer forgiveness, to love even when it feels hard. I finished my speech with a simple thank you, my heart pounding as I stepped away from the podium. The congregation erupted into applause, their faces bright with encouragement. Jamie gave me a small, proud smile, and Mark even clapped, a rare gesture from him. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something freer. After the ceremony, people lingered in the churchyard, chatting and laughing, their spirits high. Jamie came over to me, his hands shoved in his pockets, and for a moment we just stood there, taking it all in. "You did good, Mom," he said finally, his voice soft. "Thanks, Jamie," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "It means a lot to have you here." He nodded, his gaze drifting to the steeple. "It's a good thing you built there. People needed it. Maybe you needed it too." "I think I did," I admitted. "But what I've really needed is this, talking to you, reconnecting with people. It's not easy, but it's worth it." He smiled then, a real smile, and I felt a spark of hope for the future. The cracks in our relationship weren't gone, but they were healing. Slowly, steadily, the light was breaking through. As the sun set that evening, casting the steeple in a golden glow, I stood with the people who had helped make it possible. It wasn't just a building, it was a reminder of everything we could rebuild together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. As the months passed, life seemed to settle into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The steeple stood tall, its shadow stretching across the town square like a silent promise, and the conversations I'd started with Jamie and others were beginning to bloom into real connections. It was a strange feeling, letting people back in after so many years of keeping them at arm's length. Vulnerability, I realized, was like that, equal parts terrifying and freeing. One crisp morning, I found myself back at the church, this time sitting on a bench in the yard, looking up at the steeple. I thought about how much had changed since the fall, since the workshop. The memory of that golden light and the carpenter's presence had stayed with me, a quiet, constant reminder of the truth I had been shown. The cracks reveal the light. It felt less like a lesson now and more like a way of living. The cracks weren't just flaws to be hidden. They were spaces where grace could flow. While I sat there, lost in thought, Reverend Phillips approached, his usual calm presence easing into the stillness around us. "Miriam," he said, sitting beside me, I've been meaning to ask, would you be willing to share your story? With the congregation, I hesitated, the idea of standing in front of everyone again, making my chest tighten. You mean the fall? The accident? I mean everything, he said gently. What you've been through, what you've learned. People look at the steeple and see a symbol, but I think hearing the story behind it could inspire them in ways you might not expect. I thought about his words long after he left. Sharing my story felt vulnerable in a way that even repairing broken relationships hadn't. It wasn't just about admitting my mistakes, it was about opening myself up to the questions, the doubts, the judgments that might follow. But I also knew he was right. What had happened to me wasn't just for me, it was bigger than that. The following Sunday, I stood at the front of the sanctuary again, this time with no steeple to hide behind. The congregation was packed, their faces curious and expectant, and as I gripped the edges of the podium, I felt my hands tremble. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle over the room, and then I began. I know many of you already know part of my story, I said, my voice steady but soft. You know about the fall, the work on the steeple. But what I'm about to share goes deeper than that. It's something I haven't fully spoken about until now. The room was so silent I could hear the faint creak of the pews as people leaned forward. I told them about the accident, about the moments before I hit the ground, and about waking up in the hospital with a vivid memory of something that didn't feel like a dream. I described the workshop, the golden light, the carpenter, the mirror, and what I had seen there. When I looked into that mirror, I said, my voice cracking slightly, I didn't just see my life. I saw my flaws, my sins, the ways I'd let pride and pain keep me from truly loving the people around me. It was one of the hardest things I've ever faced, but it was also freeing. Because for the first time, I understood that those cracks, those mistakes, they weren't the end of the story. They were openings, places where light could shine through if I let it. I looked out at the congregation, their faces a mixture of awe and reflection. The carpenter didn't condemn me for what I'd done. He showed me the truth, yes, but he also gave me the tools to rebuild. Not just the steeple, but my relationships, my faith, my own sense of worth. And that's what I want to share with you today. No matter how broken we feel, no matter how deep the cracks go, there's always a chance for restoration. But we have to be willing to face the truth, to let the light in. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then a wave of applause rose up, filling the sanctuary with warmth. People came up to me afterward, sharing their own stories of struggle and redemption, their words weaving a tapestry of connection I hadn't expected. It was humbling, hearing how my story had touched them, how it had mirrored their own journeys in ways I couldn't have anticipated. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the community. People seemed to come together more readily, offering help where it was needed, mending old wounds that had festered for too long. The steeple became more than just a structure. It became a symbol of what we could accomplish together, of the beauty that could grow out of brokenness. For me, life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still hard days, moments of doubt and regret. But now, I carried the memory of the workshop and the carpenter with me, a quiet assurance that I wasn't alone in my struggles. The cracks in my life hadn't disappeared, but they had been transformed, each one a testament to the grace that had carried me through. One evening, I found myself back in a dream, standing in the golden light of the workshop once more. The carpenter was there, his presence as steady and calm as before, and on the table before me was the mirror I had built. It shone with a quiet brilliance, its surface whole and clear. But when I looked closer, I saw the faint lines where the cracks had been. I turned to the carpenter, my heart full of questions, but he simply nodded, his gaze filled with a love that was both humbling and overwhelming. The cracks revealed a light, he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. And then I woke, the memory of his words lingering in my heart. I didn't need to see the workshop to know it was still there, just as I didn't need to see the cracks in the mirror to know they were a part of me. They always would be, but now they were something more. They were a reminder of the light that had transformed them and a promise that no matter how broken the world seemed, there was always hope for restoration.